So like Rom said, this is a version of my thesis talk, which I gave just a few weeks ago successfully. So that's very nice. And it's not, as Rom said, it's not neuromorphic specifically. It's not about, we're not going to talk about spikes, but we are going to talk about a theory of work that's adjacent to neuromorphic community. The neuromorphic community worries about how to make brain-inspired computational systems, and this is thinking about a different thing that the brain does and figuring out how to actually do it in a robot. So I think you'll find it interesting. So the title is Foundations of Embodied Representation, which means robotics without a ruler. Let me give you a specific example. Hold on, my slides aren't switching. There we go. So you're all sitting in front of desks and you have many things in front of you, and there's some distance from your eye to any of those objects. What is this distance? You can't tell me what it is in centimeters or inches or feet, at least not exactly, but you can go reach out and touch anything you want precisely and immediately, which means that you do know exactly where the objects are, just not in centimeters, inches, or feet. Instead, you know what you need to send your motors, your muscles from your motor system to go and touch those objects. Where things are is coded not in terms of metric distances, but in terms of actions that you need to take and reach those objects. And all animals have this situation. After all, my dog doesn't know what a meter is. But if you take today's robots and you ask them to do something very basic, like fit through a door, the standard way of doing things is to put a pre-calibrated stereo or LiDAR camera on that robot, measure the distance and width of that door in meters, and then somebody would have taken a ruler and measured the width of the robot also in meters. And if the width of the robot is less than the width of the door, the robot fits and we know what to do. And this is fine. The situation is fine. We have lots of very cool robots out there doing things, but the cracks are beginning to show. For one, there's these multi-billion and trillion-dollar industries involved with keep making stereo cameras and LiDAR systems and making sure that they remain calibrated. On the left, I have a visualization from a company I used to work for, where they make these very ruggedized stereo cameras that keep the calibration between the cameras to sub-degree and sub-millimeter precision, despite being knocked, shaken, or heated. These cameras are very expensive. Then there's LiDAR systems, which are appearing on commercial projects like drones. And on the bottom, I have a video. Actually, can I get, I would like to have a laser pointer here. There we go. On the bottom, I have a video which shows how these systems have to be calibrated in the wild by a user, or the maps that they take won't make any sense. And then finally, a system that's becoming very ubiquitous among the general public is adaptive driving assistance systems. These are networks of cameras and LiDARs and sonars around cars that help with things like blind spot, occupancy detection, parallel parking assist, etc. But when you get in a minor fender bender, these systems all have to be recalibrated to sub-millimeter precision, which is shown by this video on the bottom right. This involves lasers and special calibration targets, etc. And all of these examples are unnatural. You were never told what well, you may have been told your interpupillary distance, that is the distance between your eyes, once at a doctor, but I doubt you remember it. Humans don't have laser rangefinders, and when you drive a car, you certainly don't know where your head is in the car to sub-millimeter precision. In fact, it's bouncing around and changing all the time. We'd like to get away from this. Then, even if you get everything right about using external units, you get your calibrations on par, there are problems that can happen inside of your processing systems just because you depend on these units. So my favorite example is in 1999, the Mars Climate Orbiter hit the surface of Mars because the engineers failed to convert inches to centimeters, essentially, and the parachute was deployed at the wrong time. Humans can't have this problem. We only have one unit that we're using. It's an internal one. It's an embodied one, and there's nothing to confuse. We even see, I have more space examples, which I'll go through very quickly. We see that there's a lot of trouble with landing on the moon right now because of dependence on calibration to an external unit like the meter. In the 60s, we had several successful landings from the Soviets and the Americans. And even recently, there were several successful missions from China. But then the problems began. Israel has tried to land on the moon a few times and they failed. The Japan's iSpace unit also failed because they couldn't, let me see if I can remember the reason. This one, they couldn't localize over the surface of the moon with it to the meter accurately enough. Luna 25 from Russia crashed, though they haven't told us exactly why. India succeeded. Japan landed upside down, which means they weren't able to adaptively control themselves in their descent. Something went wrong and their calibration was not right, and they landed upside down. This happened to all as well to a company from the United States. Blue Ghost succeeded. And finally, the latest probe from Japan failed because their laser altimeter was inaccurate. And most of these failures can be traced down to some kind of calibration failure. They've assumed they can measure something in meters or inches. And when they got to the surface of the moon, they weren't exactly able to do that. Most notably, our most long and successful set of missions to land on the moon, the Apollo missions, were actually human controlled. The human would fly the ship, change what they're doing based on the current conditions, and look out a window in order to determine what they need to do to land. And that means they were being adaptive and they were using these embodied units to actually land the spacecraft. But our more autonomous counterparts have a high failure rate. Finally, in DC, we had a plane crash over the Potomac early in January. And while there are many reasons for this crash, and the helicopter should never have been near the aircraft in the first place, it appears that the helicopter eventually crashed into the airplane because it was flying at the wrong height, because its altimeter was inaccurate. And so we'd like to get away from these problems. We'd like robots that are able to adapt and learn to do things themselves without this calibration to the meter, which can be so fickle and cause so many problems. For example, we would like to realize something like the dog, who knows where this disc is because they can jump and immediately reach it. They know where it is in terms of the muscle stimulation they have to send. But this goes further than that. We can imagine humans who, when they insert a screw, they've learned exactly what they must feel with their fingertips when they switch from the screw to the screwdriver. Or the hummingbird, who has somehow found a way to stabilize their head independently of their body so that they can view the world from a stable way. And all of these things were done without necessarily a calibration to the meter. Instead, these systems learned to do this online. So we call all of this embodied representation, the idea that you would use the signals from your own body and what you see to learn to do a task in terms of what you must send your body, that's the embodied part, to do that task. And to figure out how to solve this problem, I'm going to take you through some history, with some of which involves computational neuroscience. In 1920, Jacob von Uexküll published this famous book called Theoretical Biology. It was translated to English in 1926. And this proposed one of the first high-level studies of cognition, what we would associate with psychology and sometimes computational neuroscience today. He called it theoretical biology because there was no other field than biology to call it. And he called it theoretical because he recognized that it was at a higher level and was based on theories and hypotheses of box diagrams and such that would later need to be validated. And most importantly, in this book, his most famous concept he introduced was the umwelt, which is that idea that animals perceive only what they sense. As an example, this wasn't the slide I wanted to see. Yeah, here we go. As an example, the tick's umwelt. The ticks don't have real eyes, and so there's no reason to believe that they perceive a three-dimensional world. Instead, what they sense, at least according to Uexküll, is light sensitivity. They can kind of tell what direction is up or down based on where the sun is. They can smell skin oils, so they know where their prey is, and temperature, which tells them if they successfully landed on prey and should bite. And Uexküll drew the use of these senses as this circle here. And he said that the senses would come in from the world and they would go to a mark organ, which translates to perceptual organ. So the higher level, the perceptual functions of your cortex. And then they would affect change through the action organ, which would eventually stimulate the muscles or make the tick jump or bite or do whatever it needs. And all of this can be expressed without necessarily having a 3D world. And so Uexküll says that the tick's umwelt is very limited. It only senses these three things and it can't tell anything more. But going to higher level animals like the mammals, we have the ability to react to what we sense, but we also have the ability to modulate what they sense. For example, I'm holding a cup right now. I'm not sure if you can see my video. I'm holding a cup and my brain can recognize it as a shape that has a certain convexity to it, and so on and so forth. This might be what the lower level animals always see. But if I am thirsty and I would like to drink, then somehow I'm able to recognize this cup not just as a shape, but as something to drink from, an implement. It has an affordance, as we would say in Gibson's framework. And to explain this, Uexküll introduced what he called the new circle. This is an internal feedback from the action system to the perception system, the mark organ here. And it's supposed to tell the perceptual system what it's looking for and why, so that it recognizes objects not just as shapes, but as something that maybe could be drinking from, as it would be the case if the action system wanted to take a drink of water. But Uexküll limited this idea to the very highest levels of cognition and said only the higher animals like monkeys and humans would have this. He turned out to be right. In 1980 to 2010, Joachim Fuster, a famous neuroscientist, showed that not only do we have this internal feedback at our highest levels of our cortex, that is really the cognitive domain, which is shown with this red arrow back from the prefrontal cortex to the posterior cortex, but it's also at every level lower than this. So it's in the middle levels and the bottom levels, the levels that just really help you stabilize or stand or walk. And it's at these lower levels that we become interested in the internal feedback that Uexküll brought. Now, real quick, I want to go back to Uexküll one more time. It should be noted that Uexküll did consider embodied distances, distances that are not due to meters or inches. He noted that all animals must have their own senses of distance and said that if we want to really understand the worlds they live in, we need to understand what these units are and how they use them. But he stopped short. I mean, this was in chapter 2 of his book. He stopped short of actually specifying a method. He left that to future work. And so this idea kind of died off throughout the years. It was never fully studied as far as I know. Okay, so Uexküll gives us 2 ideas. And now we move to understanding what we can do with low-level internal feedback. So if we consider the lowest level here, where internal feedback comes from the primary cortex, the primary sensory cortex, we can actually find evidence of, in even simple animals, that this kind of feedback exists. So for example, here's a dragonfly that must take off and capture some prey, this insect here. And what's interesting is that as the dragonfly turns towards its prey, its head moves independently of its body and predicts where the fly will be before the dragonfly could know where it will be. And this is because there's a 50 millisecond delay in the processing system of a dragonfly's brain, which means if it actually wants to capture this fly, it has to move its head before it knows where the prey is. 50 milliseconds is a lot of time if you're trying to capture a fly. This diagram on the right shows what would happen if the body of the dragonfly moved, but the head was fixed. You would see that the insect would not remain on the fovea of its eyes. But with this predictive motion, it's actually able to keep the prey very close to the center. Now, this idea of using your own unit hasn't really come to robotics at all. And so the reason for this starts from this book called Vision, which was written in 1982 by David Marr, who tragically died very young. And so in this book, Vision is a passive system, and the camera is along for the ride. So the idea here is that you mount a camera onto a robot. The robot goes and does whatever tasks it needs to do, and the camera just sits there. It never looks at a particular object for a particular reason. The robot never moves in a certain way to make the camera's job easier. Instead, it's just kind of a sensor that's there to collect and build a 3D scan of the world. And this creates something that we call sense plan act, which looks very much like Uexküll's first feedback loop, which didn't have the internal feedback in it. And all of this is assumed to be coordinated with the meter, a prearranged external unit. Later theories like active vision, which were popularized by my own advisor and others, appeared by the end of the 1980s, which addressed the fact that cameras should move in order to see particular objects for particular reasons and to make computer vision problems easier. I reproduced this table from the paper Active Vision, which shows that if you were to have a moving camera and you tried to solve traditional computer vision problems, like shape from shading or structure from motion, that it would be much easier if you could move the camera in a certain way. In fact, nonlinear constraints become linear, and so on. But in these frameworks, while the camera was actively controlled and the cognitive aspects of vision are emphasized, the units are all still assumed to be meters. We are assumed that we have some robot that follows sense plan act. As an example here of sense plan act, I show a traditional state estimation system, which takes input from a camera or an inertial sensor like an accelerometer and feeds it back to a state estimator, which might and typically estimates the position of the robot in meters and the position of everything around it in meters. Then some planning system takes that state estimate in meters and decides what the robot should do. This is the cognitive side of the robot. But then something funny happens. The robot itself, which in this diagram we call the plant, doesn't take meters as input. Instead, it takes voltages or currents, some very low-level signal that gets sent to its motors. And so what we've assumed here is that we're going to put voltages and currents in. These are embodied signals. And we've turned them into meters. So there's a conversion that happens, and our robot has to be calibrated in order for that conversion to work. And similarly, we expect the control system engineers to take commands in meters from the planner and convert them to voltages and currents or whatever signals are required to make the robot accomplish that trajectory in meters. And so we see this funny situation where the control system has to be calibrated to the meter, the robot itself has to be calibrated to the meter, and if we do everything correctly, these embodied units will cancel out and we can pretend the whole thing was done in meters again. And so this is the status quo. But my work asks, what happens when we add this internal feedback, as we discussed, as is inspired by computational neuroscience, back from the control system to the state estimator? And can we use this to imply some sort of embodied unit that we use throughout the system so that the robot no longer needs to be calibrated to the meter? So I've taken you through the history that motivates us, and then I'm going to take you into the specific works of my thesis. So the first considers embodied feedback. When humans walk around, they are constantly fixating on specific objects for specific reasons. So here I show a human walking on rough terrain, and they're glancing at different rocks that they eventually place their feet on top of. It is thought that while they look at these specific objects, they're measuring something called time to contact with their eye. To understand what time to contact is, I'm going to return to the original example from 1976, introduced by David Lee. So when you approach a car and you are driving, that car looms in your field of view, getting bigger and bigger and bigger. It turns out that the rate of this expansion can be measured by your eye as time to contact, the time it would take you to hit that car if you traveled at your current speed from your current distance. David Lee, a psychologist from the United Kingdom, proposed that all humans use this kind of signal for braking and stopping their car on time, and even went on to propose what he called the general tau theory, which is an idea for how humans could use time to contact by looking and glancing at particular objects to control their general navigation or to control timing of specific actions, like is shown with this bird that needs to retract its wings just before it hits the water, catching balls, or running on treadmills. And he proposed many ways that we could use time to contact to regulate these behaviors, but no specific control laws that actually do it. Now, mathematically, we can try to realize this in robots, and so then we have to write down some equations. What is time to contact in equation form? Well, if a robot is moving towards a door and it's at a certain distance and it has a certain speed, then the time to contact is simply the distance to that door divided by that z dot. And I'm going to state without proof that we can measure this with a camera. Similarly, we can get an equally meaningful quantity if the robot is not moving towards the door, but is moving to the side, like say on the X direction marked here. And it turns out the camera can then measure a sort of time to contact, z over x dot, which is the time it would take the robot to reach the door if it were traveling with its x velocity that it currently has at the door. So even though it's not actually moving towards it, it's still a form of time to contact. These things define what we call a linear time-varying system, whose details I will skip. Basically, the idea is that we can get an ordinary differential or a time-varying differential equation for our velocity times this time to contact quantity times our position. We can get an equivalent thing for the x direction. And if you take these quantities and integrate them in a special way from time to contact, we get what we call a transition matrix, which I have outlined here. This matrix tells us where we would be. This is our XYZ position if we knew where we started, which is the X naught, Y naught, Z naught, and it's multiplicative. And so what we see is this bio-inspired idea of time to contact based on fixation really gives us a transition matrix, which tells us where we would be if we knew where we started. And this is actually just position to scale. So if I return back to the diagrams, the idea here is that if the robot were to move along a figure-8 pattern, and it had measured its time to contact on the Z and the X directions, then we would have recovered this matrix signal phi, and it would tell us something about how we move, but not everything. For example, if the robot were twice as close to the door and moved half as much, it would actually measure the same time to contact signal, which means that no matter what you do with vision, with computer vision algorithms, you're always going to end up in a situation where the units are undefined. You don't know necessarily what any of the distances are. You just know the ratios between your movement. And so if a robot is to then use its own embodied units, we must get those units from some other part of the system. And for this, we turn to the units of action. So while the robot is moving, imagine it has its eyes closed. So here I show the robot's eyes are closing. Imagine the robot's eyes are closed, and it moves along in that same figure-8 pattern. Then it does know something about its motion. It knows what it sent its motors to make it travel that figure-8, typically in terms of a force or a torque. But it doesn't know exactly what these forces and torques are. It knows that it sent some input U into the system, and it got multiplied by some unknown gain, which depends on the strength of the motors and the mass of the robot and many other things. And it is turned into an acceleration x double dot. And so we know U, we don't know B, and we know that it turns into x double dot, which has certain properties, but again, we don't know what the exact number is. Still, if mathematically we analyze this and we say, well, I can double integrate my actions, which are forces, to get where I am in the future, up to the unknown position and unknown initial velocity, we get an equation we can use in our math, which will have some useful properties. The first property is to realize that we do have access to a unit. We just don't know what it is. So let's suppose the acceleration of our robot is in meters per second squared, as is commonly assumed. And we know our input U, and so we just don't know what B is. While we never know what the input gain B is, we can realize that it's actually a unit conversion factor. It's taking the commands U, which are in some kind of embodied unit. They exist, but we don't know what it is. And it's scaling it to meters. And so B is just this conversion factor from meters, or from embodied units to meters. And we can use it through all of our equations to convert everything back to embodied units. So for example, if we take the transition matrix mentioned earlier, which was measured from vision, and we set it equal to the results of action, which are on the right-hand side of this equation, then we get a constraint between vision on the left-hand side and action on the right-hand side that maybe if we manipulate in a special way, we would be able to figure out where we are. That is in x naught or x dot naught. But immediately, if we try to use this constraint, it's not going to work because every single unknown term here, x naught, x naught, x dot, and b, has multiplied against something that is known, which means that if you were to have some solution for this equation, then scaled versions would also satisfy the solution. And so there would just be no unique answer. But what if we were to divide through by this unknown term b, this conversion factor from the embodied units to meters? Then we would realize these lumped quantities shown on the bottom, which are just our position in embodied units and our velocity in embodied units. And we have a problem with the unique answer because the double integral of u, the action term, appears on its own. And this is the kind of optimization problem you get when you try to optimize for these things. It looks complicated, but it's just linear least squares. If you have questions about that, we can discuss later. And so at this point, we have recovered a state estimate in these embodied units, but we need to show that they're actually useful. If I were just a computer vision engineer working on my own and I gave you some state estimate and said, hey, I don't know the units, but they're there, that would be useless. But because I am a control system as well, we're also considering the way the robot acts as part of the same computer vision and control system. We get a nice property. So here we show kind of a sense plan act diagram, but we've changed it. We've added this internal feedback from the control system to the embodied representation. And this is going to allow us to imply the state estimate in the embodied unit mentioned before. And then the planning system will run in the embodied units. And of course, the control system can run in the embodied units. There's been no conversion yet. And finally, this is the most important part. The one thing that we don't know, which is this unknown scale factor B, is going to cancel out in the closed loop. So in the closed loop dynamics, we can pretend as if we know what X is in meters. But actually, we only know it in the embodied units. And the reason we don't need to know is because the embodied units, the effect of the embodied units actually cancel with the plant dynamics in the closed loop. What we've realized here is that without a calibration, we can make the unknown things we don't know cancel right out. Comparing this to sense plan act again, we see that on the top, on the top, we had state estimates in meters, and then we had to depend on the control system to convert from meters to the embodied units, and the robot, which is calibrated to convert from embodied units to meters. However, in our embodied representation context, everything can be embodied, and instead of depending on this conversion, we depend on this cancellation, which will always occur. And so we can say the robot will always be stable. When you test this in an experiment, this is something I did years ago, you get the following 4 results. So if you take a robot and you set its B factor to 1 and you estimate the state in meters and you put a PID controller on it, you can run it forward and make it stop in front of a flower successfully. That's expected. And of course, the system using embodied units, which in this case are just actually meters because B is set to 1, everything works as expected again. But the trouble begins when you change the robot and don't tell it. So for example, in the top right here, I have made the robot's motors twice as strong as before, and we're running the same control system as before. And the result is that the open loop gain is twice as much, and so the thing destabilizes, it crashes into the flower and generally fails. It never settles. But for the embodied system, this change in motor strength is not a problem. It's just a change to the units that the robot is using. Now things are, let me see, if it's twice as strong, then things are now half as far away, and it can adjust everything about its system accordingly. The cancellation occurs, and it still settles in front of the flower as desired. So this first paper was published in ICRA in 2023. The second thing I want to talk about, the second work, is called embodied representation. So I've shown you how to use embodied units to create a self-calibrating feedback loop, which is invariant to control gain. But this is only part of the picture. We can regulate ourselves, but it doesn't mean we can actually do anything cognitive. And so we asked this question, what are these embodied representations useful for outside of closed loop feedback? Can we use it to represent the robot's own size? Can we use it to represent the world and where objects are and how big they are? Can we use it to estimate our own dynamics if we have things more complex than forces, simple forces? And the answers to all of these things is yes. And this is developed in this embodied representation paper. There's 2 case studies that are very important that this paper considers. The first one is uncalibrated clearing, which, as far as I know, has not been solved in robotics till now. This is a basic problem where if you have a robot that doesn't know what the meter is, it doesn't know its initial size, strength, or size of anything in the world. You could imagine it was just born exactly. This robot needs to figure out if it fits through a door before it gets to the door. Now, humans can do this, and it was debated for several decades whether animals could do it, but it was recently shown bees can do it quite well, though the actual mechanisms are not known. And like I said, in robotics, I'm unaware of anybody actually solving this problem. We always take a ruler and somehow measure the robot or the door beforehand. The second problem that we considered is called uncalibrated jumping, which is where a robot needs to jump an unknown gap in an environment with an unknown gravitational force and with unknown muscular dynamics. We also solved this problem. To do so, we had to generalize our visual representations from what we had before. Before we assumed we had time to contact, and it gave us this transition matrix we called phi tau. But we can also show that almost all computer vision algorithms give us some sort of transmission matrix like phi. However, the multiplier on the right-hand side can be different. So if you have a stereo camera, you get a system where you just need to this unknown multiplier is the distance between the two cameras. And if you were to do structure from motion, it would be up to the object size. And in all of these cases, even though people sometimes claim stereo gives you 3D immediately, what we realize is that it just gives you position up to, again, another unknown scale. And so we call this scale of vision D. We multiply it by the transition matrix to give us X. And we'll now use this phi W of D through all of our equations and just need to estimate this D at times. I'm going to skip this part, but basically in this paper, we also, we had a whole generalization for robot dynamics, which allows our theory to apply to a broad class of robots, robot dogs, robot arms, rolling robots, etc. And all of those platforms will be the subject of future work. But in this paper, we showed that you can encapsulate their dynamics this way. And so the key here is still at the end of the day, we get a constraint, which is much more general. This looks like something I showed you before, except that the scale of vision D is no longer fixed to be the same as initial position. And we have some more dynamics that we may need to estimate the parameters of online. And so this generalization allowed us to solve the uncalibrated clearing problem in this way. On the right, we have a robot. It doesn't know its size. It doesn't know the distance to any of these targets. It doesn't know their width, etc. And it needs to fit through this gap. Oh, and it also doesn't know its strength. To solve this problem, it's going to oscillate back and forth in front of this target here, which is actually something bees tend to do while they are being born, while they're very young. And while doing so, it can end up measuring the distance from the camera to that target and the width of that target in the embodied unit. Then, using the stable closed-loop control I mentioned earlier, it can approach the target at a steady speed. This is important. If we weren't able to approach at a constant speed, we wouldn't be able to touch it at a safe speed. Then we know that when we touch it, the distance from our camera to that object is 1/2 the width of our body, and therefore we know the full width of our body. And finally, all that is left is to measure the width of the opening in the embodied unit, and then we do a simple comparison to see if we fit. If the gap is too narrow, then the robot can still measure this, and it will tell us no. It should shake its head back and forth here for a second. There we go. And we tested this over many different conditions. Of course, it's math and it's all model based. So if it doesn't work, then the experiment is wrong. But we got it to work over a wide range of conditions. So here I show the width of the body on the bottom and the target width, both measured in the embodied units as we change the B gain, which is the strength of the motors, and we get further and further from the initial target. You'll notice the results become a little bit inaccurate when we use our smallest motor gain, which means the robot oscillates back and forth the least and at our furthest distances. However, the thing to remember is the target was only 6 pixels wide at these distances, which we would normally associate with point measurements, not as something we could actually measure the width of. So in actuality, the way we have set up these estimation problems turns out to be quite accurate, surprisingly. We also, on the right, we do show the same thing, but we're measuring the width of the body and the target width as we change the width of the touch target. And of course, nothing really changes. Finally, I show here the closed loop convergence diagrams for each of these gains. So as the robot approaches the opening when the B factor is set to 1/2, we get graphs that look like this, and B equals 1, graphs that look like that. But what I want you to take away from this is that they all look very qualitatively similar. They both look like a second order underdamped system, which decays in about 2 or 3 oscillations. And this is what is predicted by the gain cancellation in our theory. We should see this kind of qualitative behavior remaining exactly the same, and that's what we see. The second case study was uncalibrated jumping. And for this, we made the problem a little bit harder because one of the comments you often get when you write a paper like this is that your dynamics model is too simple. So you've assumed that x double dot equals BU, which is no robot actually has that model. And somehow there is some dynamics between what we put into the robot and what we get out of it in terms of acceleration. So in this study we did in simulation, and we modeled the acceleration of this jumping agent, which needs to jump over a gap, as an input convolved with some low pass response, first order impulse response actually, times x double that equaled x double dot. And we don't know what this impulse response is. We don't know the strength of gravity, and we don't know the weight of the robot, etc. But we still need to jump a gap. I'm going to skip the math again, but you have to do a lot of extra steps when you involve the dynamics. But the point remains you can still measure everything in some kind of embodied unit, and it will tell you what to do. On the right, I have a video where this jumper is going to oscillate up and down, and it has to jump this gap of unknown distance. I'm going to keep changing the distance as we go along, the strength of gravity, etc., and the robot will keep jumping this distance. To do so, it follows a procedure much like the uncalibrated clearing, which I show on the top on the left-hand side. The robot must oscillate up and down. Actually, gerbils who jump gaps do just this. They bob up and down with their knees, and the further they have to jump, the harder they bob up and down. And while it's bobbing up and down, it measures what it sent to its motors and how the red line that it needs to jump to moved in its field of view. From this, we can set up a problem involving embodied representation, which tells us the distance to be jumped in the embodied units, the gravitational force in the embodied units, and the actual actuator dynamics, the way our muscles respond to inputs also in the embodied unit. And you get a big convex optimization problem to do this. Finally, we have an optimal control problem we solve. It's a basic ballistics problem for the input that will make you jump the gap all in the embodied units. And then you execute it, and the robot succeeds. We tested this. Of course, this is in simulation, so it works over a lot of conditions, but we tested it anyway. You can change the jump distance, and the robot will always jump the right distance. We changed the actuator time constant, which is how laggy the legs respond to inputs. We change that by a factor of 4, and it would always jump about the same distance. Camera resolution, strength of gravity, etc. The story remains the same. However, what you'll notice on the bottom is the jumping control input U actually is automatically changed as the embodied units change due to the changing actuator constant, or the strength of gravity being changed, or this actual B factor itself being moved up and down. So what we've realized is the system that can adaptively, on its own, first time right away, learn what it needs to do to accomplish the task. Unlike the spacecraft we saw earlier, which are all failing because the conditions weren't exactly as they expected. So that brings us towards the middle part of these two works, where we realize that embodied representation is really a concept. We're proposing a paradigm shift for the way that we should do robotics, and saying that robots, while they may use meters and inches at a high level, should use embodied units at their lowest level so that they remain stable and can adapt to their worlds and situations they encounter. And this concept goes to more than just distances. What we're saying is that the system should estimate what information it needs to do a task online without depending on a human to bring a ruler and tell it something beforehand. It can do so using signals from its own body. And by doing so, we're drastically minimizing the dependence on prior calibration and models. And this has allowed us to solve two problems in robotics that are not solved. And so we explored this idea with two follow-up works, which I will outline briefly. The first was key insertion. So when you go to insert a key into a lock, you don't exactly know the shape of the key. You don't know the shape that's inside the lock. And for this reason, we can say that your model of the world is uncalibrated. And further, if you get stuck, you will wiggle the key and try to insert it further to see if it gets unstuck. And you can learn to feel exactly if that key is stuck or unstuck as you go along. But a similar ability has not been realized in robots. So we decided to use our embodied representation and see if we could do it. To do so, we use this sensor called the GelSight Mini. It's a touch sensor that tries to simulate what skin might feel. And if you press an object against it, internal cameras will observe the deformation of the skin as changing colors, and you can get very accurate depth or distance maps from this. So we grasped a key between two of these sensors and set it to a robot that is wiggling. And what you see here is that the gel pad can tell if the key is being pushed against the side of the lock or not. And so the robot could try to minimize that strain and insert it further and further. The result was this following control system where we take a robot arm and we wiggle its 6 degree of freedom post. That's the position and the 3 orientation signals. And with the Gel Sight Mini, we estimate the amount of strain that's on the key because it's being pressed into the lock. And we set up a dual goal optimization problem where we want to maximize the depth that the key was inserted into the lock while minimizing the strain against the gel pad on the Gel Sight Mini. And there's a whole control system here, which is really called extremum seeking control. But the key here is we use this internal feedback signal from the way we are wiggling to compare it to the changes in the strain and the insertion depth directly online without a prefixed calibration. This allows us to calculate ways to adjust the wiggling to move the post of the robot left or right or rotate it to the side or not. That allows us to guide the key into the lock without any further processing. And so here I show this same algorithm working on 4 types of locks all at once. It's a little slow. However, you have to remember that we're only imitating the wiggling part of inserting a key. We're not actually trying to just press the key in, which you would normally do to save a lot of time. When we tested this on different keys, which, by the way, keys are considered very hard in the robotic insertion literature where they normally consider just smooth objects and smooth pegs. We got very good success rates, over 90% on 2 of them, slightly lower on the dimpled and tubular locks. However, these locks are much harder because the dimpled lock has surfaces that slope away from the lock, and the tubular lock is mostly flat. We also tested on a benchmark that is often used to test reinforcement learning algorithms for insertion. We got almost 100%. We missed one trial out of 50, while the competing method, the baseline method, which is a reinforcement learning algorithm trained on these specific objects, got much lower scores. So we think we found a principle here for insertion. The second work I'll show you, or the second follow-up work I'll show you, is stable vision for an ornithopter. So we have this robot in our lab called the flapper. It has 4 wings, which are 2 independent pairs that allow it to fly. And normally I would fly it for you if this were an in-person talk, but today we'll have to use a video. Here's a video of the flapper flying, and it's quite quiet and agile craft, and very pleasant compared to most drones. Let's see if it'll do any acrobatic maneuvers. There we go. It can be quite agile, and it's thought of as an alternative to drones in spaces where you have humans and you need things to be safe. So for example, greenhouses or stage performances is actually where these are currently sold the most. But flappers have a problem, which is limiting their utility in future applications. My flapper is one of the only ones with an onboard wireless camera. And when you capture video from that flapper, it looks like this. It's shaking all around, it's blurry. No human wants to see this, and no visual odometry algorithm or computer vision algorithm wants to see frames like this. And it's limited applications, like I said. Animals have solved this problem many times over. So on the left, I have the hummingbird from before, which is able to stabilize its head despite its body shaking. On the right, I have the more extreme example of a chicken, which has quite the ability to hold its head in place as its body is moved around. Such mechanical stabilization systems have been replicated about 1 time in the history of flapping robots that I'm able to find. It was 1 paper, it was a one-off, it's considered very difficult and expensive. And so we'd like to avoid this if possible. But there's another source of bio-inspiration we can take to solve this problem, and it's the way your eye moves. So your eye moves with 2 types of movements primarily. One is called a saccade. These are conscious, and it's when your gaze shifts from one object to the next. The other is called a microsaccade, and this occurs even when you try to hold your eye still. So if you take a look at something on your desk and you fix your eye on it and hold it as still as you can, your eye will still be moving with these microsaccades, which are less than a degree usually, but you don't perceive them. Now, it's not known exactly why the body does microsaccades, nor is it known exactly how they're removed from the visual perception, but we can imagine what this might mean for a flapper. Imagine the flapper has flown along and it's shaken and vibrated along its path. If you were to remove the, quote, microsaccades in its vision, which are really just its own shaking, then you would have created a video that looks like it was taken from a smooth viewpoint that just follows the original flapper, maybe lags slightly in time. And so we set up an algorithm to do just that using internal feedback. So the flapper is on the left. It's going to be shaking and producing frames. Now the frames are not actually this blurry. What I've done is I've taken 6 frames consecutive in time, stacked them on each other, and shown you that they are shaking there's a lot of shaking, which is why this is so blurry. We can try to align these frames in SO3, which means we find a transformation that rotates the bottom image and makes it match the right top image. I'll give another example. This involves internal feedback. This is an internal estimation problem. We can low pass filter the resulting rotations to get a viewpoint that moves in a stable manner. And finally, we can do some image processing steps to take multiple frames and multiple rotations and combine them to get this crisp, clear photo on the right. Now, this photo on the right is actually the same 6 frames that were shown on the left. They've just been moved and rotated so that after averaging, you get a crisp image. And we call all of this artificial microsaccade compensation. To explain how we do the alignment, there's 2 typical ways to do image alignment. One involves taking features. So for those who are unfamiliar, what this means is you track all the corners in an image. So you track a corner here and a corner here and a corner here, and you try to find them in the next image, and then you rotate the 2 images to match. But these images are a little bit blurry and a little bit noisy, and this really inhibits feature matching based on corners. What would be much better is if we could use the whole image to do this. And that's what we do. We take a second image and we optimize to find the rotation and translation that makes it line up directly with the previous image. And this required us to go back to some very old papers and implement Lucas Canade methods for rotations, which, while they're mentioned in the original 1981 paper, there's no implementations of it that I can find. And it's quite efficient. It runs in real time. Let's get to the results. Here's the results. So on the left, we have the shaking video from the flapper as it flies through a class lab room. On the right, we have the results of my algorithm, which is nice and smooth, a little bit blurrier, but the smoothness is there, and we can now start to use this in applications. On the bottom left, we have a result of stabilization from Adobe Premiere Pro. If you Google best video stabilization software available, this is what you find. It's based on feature matching, and it uses a different motion model, which actually warps and distorts the video in unnatural ways. Finally, on the bottom right, we have a variant of our algorithm called the saccade variant, which holds the view as stable as possible, as rotationless actually, until it is forced to switch to maintain a reasonable field of view. The bottom view here is what you would show a robot's control system software, and the top view is what you would show a human. Here's another view in the Kim Building atrium here on the University of Maryland campus. And once again, you can see that our algorithm is quite good. In fact, it's because of its combining frames, it's actually able to filter out many of the artifacts from the wireless camera that's transmitting video. Meanwhile, Adobe Premiere does not do well as usual, and our saccade variant works as well. So in conclusion, what I've shown you is that embodied representation allows us to create powerful classes of robots that don't need precise calibrations, but can still do the most fundamental tasks in robotics. And they can do so almost immediately with just a little bit of oscillation back and forth to measure something. They can automatically adjust their body, and they still ensure correct operation. All of this is accomplished by doing something that's a little uncomfortable. We have to exchange units that we know, like meters and inches, for embodied units, which we don't know what they are, to build representations. The robot will still have a number. It'll know that the width of some opening is 5 and that its own width is 3, but there's nothing physical to point to and say that these units are defined by blah. There's just nothing to point to. It's all based on the way we send signals to the muscles or the actuators of that robot. And by doing so, we can actually begin to estimate quantities and calibrations online, which make these robots adaptive and able to handle new situations. But again, it requires this one uncomfortable step. And so we have a lot of future work to do with this. We can generalize it to more robots. We're working on doing this with robot arms. I have a collaboration with the Google's DeepMind Mojoko team on a system identification framework for their simulator. And what we're showing here is that our system, which is running on the middle robot, can allow it to do gravity compensation just as well as the manufacturer's calibration, which is shown on the right, which required thousands of dollars of equipment. We also made a quad rotor do flips. So there'll be more exciting work coming in that direction soon, also with robot dogs, I believe. Finally, there's a lot of work to do on the mathematics. Everything I showed you today was based on an equality constraint, but the tau theory and other theories for visuomotor control from psychology suggest qualitative rules based on things being more than or less than what we expect. So I'd like to work on that. And finally, I would like to work on more visual representations that are loosely connected to, but inspired by this bio-inspired time to contact. Here I show an experiment from one of our recent master's theses where the robot is tracking these black lines in the scene and tracing out these surfaces in image spacetime, which it uses to localize itself. And this is different than feature matching or point correspondences because these are surfaces continuous in time with no actual point-to-point correspondence. And so with that, I want to thank you. And of course, I have to thank my co-authors on all of these works, my advisors, Yanis Limnos and Cornelia Firmuller, my collaborators, Professor De Kroon, Professor Sankat, then my lab mates, Pavan and Gabriele. All right, that's everything. Thank you.